Okay, starting with the topic. Starting with the topic, exploring novel ecosystems, challenging conservation paradigms, and embracing urban wildness with Dr. Vikram Baliga. So, what exactly is a novel ecosystem to you, and how does it differ from traditional ecosystems?
So it's an interesting concept of how our impact as humans through the Anthropocene has affected and essentially created a new type of ecology and a new type of ecosystem. Um, Traditionally, when we think of an ecosystem, we think of something that is self-sustaining and self-regulating. A natural ecosystem stays in balance on its own, and we get dynamics of different populations and all of those things. And theoretically, that requires no outside influence, right? The ecosystem manages itself. In the concept of a novel ecosystem, we're really talking about how our, I don't know, urban environments, but not just urban environments. It could be rural, it could be urban, it could be somewhere in between. It's really anything that we have done as humans creates new and different ecosystems in our spaces. So think of it as something that develops in a park or a community garden or an empty lot in a city where, yes, there may be some natural forces and species that move in and things like that, but ultimately it is a result of our influence and the things that we have done as humans.
So, how do you think novel ecosystems challenge our traditional views of conservation and restoration?
This is a challenging question in some ways because I think that unfortunately, reading through the literature on novel ecosystems, this is not a new concept in some ways, but it's something we've been discussing for, I don't know, 20 years. I think the term was coined somewhere 2005, 2006, or the 2000s. And while the concepts of our disruptions and the ecology that stem from that are um, not new, they are new in the way that we're discussing it. And I think the biggest difference in terms of conservation and restoration is to what point are we trying to restore things, right? In what way do we manage these ecosystems? And I guess by that, I mean in traditional restoration ecology, our goal in a lot of places is to put it back to some undisturbed state. And yes, sometimes that is a little bit arbitrary, right? What is undisturbed? To what point are we trying to return? And that is something that I think is up for debate and it is hotly debated in ecological sciences. But the idea of a novel ecosystem is that we're not trying to restore it to sort of a pristine, undisturbed, even though those are in some ways loaded terms, uh, state. We're trying to manage it or look at it in terms of what's here now, what has moved in, what is balancing itself in the ecosystem. And so, it challenges and pushes back in some ways, whether right or wrong, against the ideas of an invasive species and what that really means. What is something that's invasive versus something that's naturalized and all of that. So it is in a lot of ways, at least in the way that it's billed and discussed a lot of times, very different than traditional approaches to ecology and ecological restoration.
What strategies would you recommend for effectively managing spontaneous vegetation in urban areas, balancing ecological benefits with aesthetic consideration? For example, in an urban park where wildflowers have started to grow naturally, how can we maintain biodiversity while ensuring the area remains visually appealing and safe for visitors?
Well, that's really the big question, isn't it? Because I think that as we discuss this, a lot of our industry, a lot of the landscape design space, the urban, I don't know what I want to call it, the urban green industry, so to speak. It's maybe not the right way to think of it, but it fits in some ways, is looking at how do we use more native and better adapted species in our um, ecosystems, not in our urban environments, in our landscapes, I should say. And we run into this problem sometimes when we're doing this of, again, the aesthetic appeal, because in general, at least traditionally, the purpose of the urban landscape has been to be aesthetically appealing. It is intended to raise property values, raise aesthetic value of a given area, whatever that area is, whether it's a park or an open lot or your front yard, whatever. And I think that a lot of times, because of the nature of wildflowers and native grasses and all the stuff that goes along with that, the wildlife it attracts. But for this specific question for wildflowers in a park, part of it is managing those wildflowers, planting those wildflowers, if that's a track we take, in areas that are maybe not going to be places where people are trying to play soccer or whatever, right? That they're more in designated places where landscaping would normally go. Part of it too is an educational effort in what people think is acceptable in the landscape. I think that aesthetic and that ethos has changed over time, where the well manicured, perfectly cropped landscape, everything green and mowed and perfectly managed, has been sort of the status quo in the U.S. for quite some time. And those aesthetics in some ways are starting to change, but there is an educational and sort of public outreach component to, if this is the approach we want to take, we need to be working with people to be more accepting of it. Otherwise, yeah, it's always going to be a battle between people that want that perfectly mowed park where they can go out and throw picnic blankets and, play soccer or whatever they're going to do, with the need for more biodiversity, for landscapes that support pollinators and all of that. And I think that we're seeing it done in a lot of ways. Lots of parks are moving to native turf grasses and in planting beds, instead of going with whatever species of well manicured rows, they're going with wildflower plantings or native shrubs and things like that. We see it on golf courses. We see it in playing fields and all kinds of areas. So I think the public will is there. I just don't know how widespread it is to balance these two sort of conflicting or potentially conflicting ideas.
So, in the context of a novel ecosystem such as a post-industrial area undergoing ecological restoration, how effective would it be to design and implement a low-maintenance grassland terrain to enhance ecosystem value? For instance, in a reclaimed brownfield site, could establishing a low-maintenance grassland help restore soil health, support native pollinators, and provide habitat for wildlife while requiring minimal human intervention for upkeep?
Sure. I think that there is a lot of value in that. I think it could be very effective. I think species selection is probably number one: design, selection, maintenance. Because a lot of times when we're going through these restoration efforts, the long-term goal, yes, is we want this to be, totally on its own. But I think it's important to understand as we discuss this that any and every sort of urban, semi-urban, rural environment is an artificial landscape and an artificial environment, sort of by just the impact of what we're doing. So when we talk about reintroducing native species and things like that, yes, I think that's absolutely something we should be doing in well-adapted native turf grasses, or prairie grasses, I should say. But there is a sort of line there where we have to get them established. So whereas in nature, yes, the seeds would have grown over time and dropped and been put into the soil, and then when it rains, some of them comes up, all of that. When we're not dealing with a true native landscape, we're not dealing with what the ecology and the soil type and everything else that goes with it would have been 500 years ago here. We're dealing with it what it is today. So I think on the establishment side, there is a lot that goes into that. But I do think that there is a lot of potential in doing that. And we see efforts like this all over the state. There's an old coal mine in East Texas where they're doing exactly this. In fact, they have taken parts of it and put it back into grassland and native flora. And part of it, they've started a small community garden. And so there's a lot of different ways to go about this for sure.
How can you encourage public acceptance of wilder landscapes in a country where most of the population isn't interested, despite knowing their benefits for urban areas?
I think the last part of your question there is really where I want to focus, because I think most people do not know the benefits for urban areas. I think that's maybe a big assumption to make sometimes, because in our space, a lot of us understand that, right? A lot of us know that having sort of less managed landscapes are better for water, they're better for heat tolerance, they're better for fertility and pollinators and all the other stuff that goes along with it. But in my experience, it's actually not widely known. And so I think that a lot of these things come back to education. I think it comes back to telling and retelling that story of why these types of landscapes are important, and how using better adapted plants and more appropriate plants for an area really can be super important. Um, there is always going to be pushback. I think there are always going to be people that want what they want out of their landscape and out of their urban environment. And I think that that's a battle we fight. And I think it's important to understand that we're not going to get everybody, right? I think as we do this, it's important to remember that change is incremental, and that we can't just go out and convince everyone that you should tear out your lawn and put it into wildflowers, right? Because not everyone's going to do that. Not everyone wants to do that. Not everyone has to do that. I think that, but again, I go back to the fact that just the framing of this question brings up an important point, that we maybe assume more in our field than we should about what people know and what people understand, through no fault of their own. It's just everyone has a different level of familiarity and understanding with these things. And so it all goes back to education, in my opinion.
So, are there any ethical considerations or dilemmas associated with intervening in novel ecosystems, especially when they involve human-altered landscapes?
I don't know how there's a way that we cannot intervene, and I say that because any change we make in our urban setting are going to have impacts on these landscapes, on these ecosystems, even if it's an old city lot, right, that has been abandoned for years. Um, and it has over time developed into this what we consider novel ecosystem. Or maybe we're thinking about partially wild lands outside of a city or in a rural area. Just the fact that we change the cars that we put on the road, the fact that we over time change uh, weather patterns and runoff dynamics, and the way that everything works in the landscape. Maybe the question that you're asking is actually, should we purposefully intervene, right? Should we be taking a hand in it? And again, I think it goes for me back to that, if we're really diving into this idea that we want to, I don't know, establish what we have now in our urban environments as the normal for what ecology should be, I think that in some ways we have to intervene in the same way that we are currently intervening in restoration ecology, traditional restoration ecology, right? It is sort of our purpose to fix the things that we have broken, so to speak, in ecological sciences. And so I think over time, I understand that people do have some, I don't know, resistance to messing with these novel ecosystems, because we want them to behave as sort of our new normal in ecology. But I don't think that's real. I think that if we want these to flourish, so to speak, if we want this to, and I'm not saying that I do, I just, as a grander scale, if we want this to become our focus, then I think we do have to take a hand in managing and protecting these ecosystems as they develop.
Will you be considering undertaking any future research on novel ecosystems in international settings, particularly in Asian countries, leveraging your expertise and understanding of novel ecosystem dynamics? For example, exploring the adaptation of novel ecosystem concepts in tropical ecosystems in Southeast Asia, considering factors such as biodiversity conservation, land use change, and community engagement. I'm asking it because my future research is more emphasizing this topic, so I was wondering.
So personally, probably not a whole lot. I think that may be a little bit outside of my main scope of what I do. But I do think it's important. And we think about where population centers are and where most of our urbanization is globally. Southeast Asia is a major kind of hotspot for that, and those are some rich and delicate and historically very important ecosystems. So I think that even though it may not be something that I do, I think the study of that is very important, because we should be focusing on where these impacts are, right? And where we can have the biggest, I think, benefit in our field of study and in our research. Like we go where the data is, or the data are, and we go where we're necessary as scientists, I think. And so, yeah, that's, again, it's a little bit out of my scope personally, but I do think it's important.
Have you ever observed invertebrates choosing their habitats due to human-induced environmental changes that put their lives at risk?
Oh yeah, I mean, there's spiders that live in my
Yes.
house, and we are very much a live and let live kind of family, and that my son doesn't love flies and ants and stuff, so they may have to go. But like for a lot of our invertebrate friends, we either we'll put them in the garage, or if they're a particular species of spider, put them outside or something like that. But absolutely, I think any kind, and not just invertebrates, but any kind of wildlife um, is going to have conflict with human society, right? As we encroach into their native natural spaces, yeah, they're going to have to, in order to survive, move into our homes, move into city lots, forage on street trees that may have been sprayed with pesticides. There is this incredibly huge dynamic, and absolutely this comes up a lot. Here at our horticulture gardens at Texas Tech, we try to be mindful of this in terms of like what chemicals we use outside. We spray almost never outside in the garden because we plant so many flowers, that we're going to attract pollinators. And yes, there's a balance, and we have to deal with pests sometimes, but yeah, the bees and butterflies and everything else are just doing what they do, right? Their job is to go and forage and reproduce and all that. And just as a consequence of us being here, there are going to be plenty of times that they sort of take, it's weird to say it this way, but unnecessary risks when it comes to us, even though that's not their decision process, right? They're just doing what they do. Yeah, I think it happens all the time.
So, what are the ecological implications of novel ecosystems from your perspective, considering both their positive and negative aspects? And how do human activities like urbanization and climate change contribute to the formation of these novel ecosystems?
I think that, like anything, we need to, in biology and ecology, we try to hold a lot of things in tension. And to me, I'm just thinking through my answer here a little bit. Uh, I think they have their place. I think the novel ecosystem has its place. And there's a saying that we should not let perfect be the enemy of good, right? So unfortunately, as these ideas developed, there was immediately sort of friction, conflict between traditional restoration ecologists and the promoters of the novel ecosystem. So over the past 20 years, like these groups have butted heads a lot. And I think that unfortunately, a lot of times view this through an either or lens. Like either we fully commit to the novel ecosystem as it is, or we fully commit to traditional restoration ecology. And for me, I think that they both have their place. Um, I think there are plenty of positive aspects that we are still trying to encourage biodiversity in our urban spaces, in these novel ecosystem spaces. And that's important. And whether some of that biodiversity is like true native insects or wildlife or plants or not, I mean, maybe that's a trade-off we have to make. But I also do think the management and preservation of true wild spaces, whatever that means today, and aiming in spaces where we can, where we're able, outside of our immediate urban sphere of influence, even though we've gone everywhere and we've affected everything, trying to get back to a pastime is not a bad thing. I think trying to get back to a place where, um, historical species, uh, it can flourish and live and grow again is important. So I think that through urbanization, through climate change, ecosystems are going to change. And we even see that in the plant selections we can make, right? Like things that were, I don't know, considered a zone 7 plant. We're in zone 7 here. Now we can grow farther north because our climate has warmed and they can be grown effectively in areas where they have not in the past. So maybe we have to accept that to a certain extent and be okay with, okay, well, this is maybe our new normal. But I also don't think that should stop us from trying to do like traditional restoration ecology. So it's sort of, for me, it's not one or the other. It's how do these things sort of live with one another? How can we hold both of these ideas in tension?
Can novel ecosystems play a role in biodiversity conservation, or do they pose risks to native species and ecosystems?
I think if we're careful, they could play a positive role in biodiversity conservation. There's kind of two sides to this. For one, if we are, so let me use an example of ladybugs or lady beetles, right? Something we do in urban settings often for our gardens is people will go out to the store and buy ladybugs, right? Buy them in a tub because they're trying to reduce their pesticide use. They're trying to be more ecologically conscious. And we do it from a place of, I want this to be a good thing. Well, most of those ladybugs that you go and buy from a garden center are captured or farmed in like Southern California, different parts of the state or country, different parts of the world, and then brought and introduced into an area when we have our own native species of lady beetles. So while it is theoretically a good thing that we're putting in these, biocontrols, could they force out our true native populations? Yeah, sure. We've seen it over and over. We see it a lot. And so, we can pose risks to native species and ecosystems in that way, right? Or with a lot of our trees that we're introducing into urban settings because they do well in this urban setting. Well, we see escapes all the time, like with the calorie pair and some others where they're taking over native ecosystems. Again, I don't think that anyone sets out to form a novel ecosystem or work in a novel ecosystem with the idea of displacing native species. But I think that that is sometimes an unintended and an unfortunate consequence. So again, they can pose a risk for native species, but they can be beneficial. I think one other thing I'd like to discuss here is the idea that we've talked a lot about biology and ecology, but none of this exists in a vacuum, right? There is a political side to this. There is a regulatory side to this as well. And I think sometimes the harder we push on saying, let's put all our eggs into the novel ecosystem basket, so to speak, the harder we push on that, the easier it is for poor ecological conservation efforts or practices to go into effect. For example, if say there is a corporation or a government agency that's looking to take over part of a parcel of land, a native land, for whatever reason. And from an ecological perspective, maybe we don't want that. Is it easier for them to go back and say, well, it's okay if we do this because the novel ecosystem theory or idea says that, oh, we'll just establish a new ecosystem? Well, I mean, yeah, maybe, but that's not necessarily a good reason to just go out and disrupt, well-established land. So I think that it is important for us to understand as scientists and as ecologists that whichever side that we come down on of this or on this issue, that there are bigger implications because it's never just the ecology. It's never just the biology. There's always a social and governmental and philosophical component to all of these things that we discuss.
How do researchers and conservationists approach studying and monitoring novel ecosystems, considering their dynamic and evolving nature? This will be my last question.
Okay. I think we're still trying to figure that out. I think that's where we are, right? Because again, we have been working in this concept for, let's call it 20 years. which is not really a long time, you know, in the grand scheme of things. It feels like a long time. But I think that's kind of what we're working on, is how do we find and how do we research some of these boundaries between our novel ecosystems and native ecosystems? How do we find a breakdown between these issues? What are our best protocols for this? And I think I see a lot of things like scouting and so a great example is we have some researchers in our plant and soil science department, Dr. Longing and some others, that are taking urban plots of land, going back in and reestablishing wildflowers and grasses and things like that, and then monitoring what species are visiting these flowers. Are they our true native species? Are they introduced species like honeybees? Are they something in between, right? Are they something that's naturalized? Well, honeybees are naturalized, but you get the point. I think that we're, I think, still trying to poke around at this and figure out what the best plan of attack is, what our best sort of ideas are. And so I think what's being done a lot is surveying of these spaces, seeing what's there, seeing what's growing, seeing how it establishes and maintains over time. And then as scientists over time, we'll start to try to change some of these variables. What if we take out this species? What if we add this species? What if we add shade to this area so different species can establish there? So I think one of our challenges in this space long term is figuring out what our methodology should be, what our goals should be, and what we're willing to do to get there, I guess.
Thank you so much, Dr. Baliga. All the questions you explained in detail with, it was really useful. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. You probably have to hit stop on that.
Okay.
So I can hang up on my end, I guess.